Hey guys, tonight we begin with the shadowy, mud-caked world of Dark Age Britain, a time where central heating meant sleeping next to a goat. Literacy was suspicious behaviour, and a successful day meant not dying of dysentery. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up with a sneeze and a goat staring directly into your soul. It's not your goat. You don't own one. This one just wandered in last night and decided it likes your corner of the hut. You'd argue, but frankly it smells better than your cousin who usually sleeps there. Your bed is straw, not like straw, literally straw. It's poking you in places you'd rather not discuss. You're also fairly certain something is living in it, and you're both pretending not to notice each other. Above your head, the thatched roof drips mournfully. Rain? Dew? Or maybe just the roof crying in solidarity? Hard to say. Either way, your blanket is now damp, and you accept it with the numb resignation of someone who hasn't been truly dry since the Romans left. Smoke curls lazily across the single-room hut, thick enough to taste. You don't have a chimney. Nobody does. The idea of smoke leaving the building was apparently too Roman, so it just lingers here, mingling with the scent of unwashed humans, wet wool and ancient sadness. You rub your eyes with hands that haven't known soap in a week and sit up, careful not to whack your head on the low wooden beams. Last time, you knocked yourself out cold and missed 2 hours of dung collecting, which your uncle still won't let you forget. A rooster crows outside, except it's not a rooster. It's a coughing villager who's been trying to clear his throat since last Thursday. You take it as your alarm clock anyway. Your tunic waits for you in a crumpled heap by the door. It smells like goat. This time it is your goat. He peed on it. Again. But you put it on anyway because, well, what's the alternative? Naked in Dark Age Britain? You'd last 7 minutes before someone threw a bucket of pottage at you for sorcery. Your parents are already up, mumbling about planting times and someone else's sheep. Your siblings are still snoring. You step over your youngest brother, who is inexplicably wrapped in your only clean rag, and push open the rough wooden door. Outside? Mud? Inside? Slightly warmer mud. And that, dear viewer, is the start of another glorious day in the Dark Ages. You step outside, squinting into the early morning haze. It smells like damp hay, last night's fire, and something unidentifiable that's either decomposing or fermenting, maybe both. Breakfast time. Now you might think breakfast means food. Cute. That's adorable. In Dark Age Britain, breakfast is less a meal and more of a philosophical concept, like comfort or hope. You trudge over to the cooking pit. There's a clay pot over a low fire, bubbling suspiciously. You pray it's porridge. You once ate something from that pot that turned out to be boiled moss and regret. You only learned that after the village healer suggested laying down and sweating it out. Today's special? Gruel. Again. Thin, grey, and containing approximately 1 oat per person. Still, you grab a wooden bowl, it has only 1 crack this time, and ladle yourself some of the goo. You try not to think about who stirred it, or with what. There's no spoon inspection committee in the Dark Ages. You sit on a log, dodging a chicken who is entirely too comfortable around human food. The gruel steams in your bowl. You blow on it. A fly lands in it. You blow harder. The fly doesn't leave. You shrug. Added protein. Someone nearby is chewing something loudly. You glance over and see your cousin gnawing on a root, like it wronged him in a past life. He doesn't even notice the mud clinging to it. You try not to make eye contact. Your uncle complains again about how breakfast used to be better before the Romans left. He says this every morning, even though he was born 30 years after they did. You nod respectfully while gnawing your spoon like it's a bone. There is no coffee. There is no tea. There is, however, a warm herbal water your aunt claims helps with the humours. It tastes like sadness and twigs. You drink it anyway because hydration is technically important. By the end of your meal, you're not full, but you're less empty. You take that as a win. Breakfast in Dark Age Britain. It doesn't wake you up, but it does remind you that life is long, cold, and occasionally moss-flavoured. You've barely swallowed the last spoonful of gruel when your mother calls out your name, or at least what sounds like it, muffled through the scarf she's using as a head wrap. The chores await. You were hoping maybe this would be the day you get something exotic, like, say, picking herbs, or helping the blacksmith. But no. Today, like most days, your journey begins with the humble, noble task of shoveling animal dung. The perfume of Dark Age Britain. You step behind the hut where the animals are penned. There it is, a glorious, steaming tribute to the livestock gods. Pigs, goats, cows, and that one particularly vengeful sheep that waits until you're just within range before letting loose like a trebuchet. You grab your wooden shovel. It's splintery, it's warped, it weighs about the same as a small child, and its effectiveness is debatable. Still, it's your Excalibur, your destiny. You begin scooping, trying not to breathe too deeply. The trick is to breathe just enough to stay conscious, but not enough to regret being born. The pigs watch you with contempt. The goats look vaguely amused. One chicken follows you closely, judging your form like a personal trainer from hell. You pile the dung onto a sled. Not a cart, a sled, because wheels don't work very well in 6 inches of seasonal swamp. You drag it to the compost heap, a mountain of filth that vaguely resembles a sleeping dragon made of sadness. You toss the latest offerings on top. It steams ominously. You nod with pride. Dung isn't just dung here. It's fuel. It's fertilizer. It's floor patching material. It's currency if you're desperate enough. Once your cousin traded a sack of dried cow patties for half a duck. No regrets. You wipe your hands on your tunic, which at this point is just a wearable rag of crimes against hygiene. You look down at your boots, or rather, your feet wrapped in strips of cloth pretending to be boots, and sigh. You're 3 hours into the day, and your dignity left around the time you slipped and landed in something warm and soft. But hey, the pigs are clean. Your family has fuel, and your shovel hasn't broken in half yet. You, my friend, are thriving. Let's be honest, you have absolutely no idea what year it is. Not in the, what's the date today sense, more in the, what century are we in again sort of way. You think someone said it was the year 493, but then someone else insisted it was 526, and old Tilda swears it's still Roman times, which is optimistic. But really, why would it matter? You don't have a calendar. You don't have a clock. Your concept of time revolves around whether or not the sun is being rude today. There's no government-issued parchment reminding you of tax season. The only new year you recognise is planting season. That's when the village gets together to stab the dirt and argue about what the sky is trying to say. You once asked the monk at the monastery what year it was. He launched into a 3-hour rant about papal decrees, solar cycles, and why Easter can't ever just stay in one place. You nodded politely and backed away before he tried to convert your goat again. The village elder swears it's still the Age of Heroes, which probably just means his back doesn't hurt today. He says this while wearing a rusted helmet as a hat and claiming he fought off a Viking using only a broom and a dream. The children measure time in how many snowfalls since the last piglet was born. You've adapted. You now refer to major events as 3 mudslides ago, or the year of the aggressive goose. You don't know your birthday. No one does. Your age is best described as old enough to help, young enough to complain. Your mother guesses you're 15. Your grandmother says 20. The local blacksmith says you were born during the Big Fire, which helps no one. There are no New Year's resolutions. Just the quiet hope that next winter doesn't eat half the village again. So yes, technically, you live in the Dark Ages. But in your heart, you exist in a timeless soup of chores, mud, and vague seasonal anxiety. Time is an illusion, breakfast is optional, and the only thing that runs on schedule is your goat's digestive system. You, my friend, are free from the tyranny of calendars. Kind of. You were baptized, or at least sprinkled with something by a man in robes who smelled like boiled cabbage and incense. There's a wooden cross in the village church. You mumble along to Latin you don't understand. Once, you nodded during a sermon and people clapped. You think you accidentally converted again. But here's the thing. Just because you go to church on Sunday doesn't mean you don't also whisper prayers to the old tree behind your hut. The one with the weird knot that looks like your late Aunt Braga. You're not saying she lives in the tree, just that, since she died, the chickens avoid it and your brother broke out in boils when he tried to cut its branches. Coincidence? Probably. But you still leave it offerings, just in case. There's also the matter of the river spirit. Everyone knows you're not supposed to fish on certain days, or the spirit will curse your net. The priest says that's pagan nonsense, but last time old Garwin ignored it, he caught a frog that bit him, with visible teeth. He swore it called him by name. He moved inland shortly after. When someone falls ill, yes, the healer prays. But she also smears them in mud, hangs chicken bones over the door, and mumbles to the moon. You're told this is Christian healing, which is fascinating because it smells like fermented goat and mild panic. And when the harvest moon rises, the whole village gathers in silence, not to recite scripture, but to watch the sky and mutter about omens. The priest is invited, but mostly to prevent him from tattling to someone more Rome-inclined. To be clear, you do believe in Christ. You also believe in the moss on the north side of trees, the angry glint in a raven's eye, and the distinct vibe shift that happens when someone says the name Woden after dark. It's not so much that you're confused, it's that you're thorough. You're not hedging your bets, you're diversifying your spiritual portfolio. Welcome to Dark Age Britain, where saints walk beside spirits, and the forest always listens. It's a quiet evening. The chickens are finally roosting, the pigs have stopped fighting with the goats, and you're enjoying the rare moment when everything doesn't smell like something died under the floorboards. Then someone says it. Vikings. Your body tenses. You look toward the coast, even though you can't see the coast, or smell it, or access it within a week's walk. Still, a chill rolls down your spine like a monk's wine jug rolling downhill. You've never met a Viking, but you've heard things. Terrible things. Things that make your uncle, a man who once wrestled a bear for fun, break into a cold sweat and mutter about longboats and flaming huts. Vikings are the Dark Age equivalent of jump scares. They come out of nowhere, steal your stuff, burn your house, maybe compliment your livestock, then leave. No warning, no receipts, just fire and yelling in Old Norse. You heard a rumour once that they wear helmets with horns. Then someone else told you that was made up. Either way, you don't plan to get close enough to inspect anyone's millinery while they're pillaging your turnip patch. The local priest insists that prayer and fasting will protect the village. The local militia insists that running into the woods and hiding like squirrels is much more effective. So far, the squirrels have a better survival rate. Your neighbour claims to have once fended off a Viking with a rake and an aggressive scowl. He now lives in a hut with a suspiciously Viking-shaped hole in the roof and avoids loud noises. And while your village isn't coastal, and the only waterway nearby is a glorified puddle with ambition, you still sleep lightly. You keep a go-bag by the door, which consists of a hunk of stale bread and the one knife in the family that doesn't immediately bend on contact. When someone sneezes too loud, your heart leaps. When a trader arrives with a strange accent, you instinctively reach for a stick. When someone paints their face for fun, you give them the side-eye for a week. Because in Dark Age Britain, the word Viking is less of a description and more of a threat level, like yelling fire, except the fire also has a beard and demands tribute. You're feeling a little off. Maybe it's the goat you licked on a dare. Maybe it's the suspicious meat you ate just to be polite. Or maybe it's that your daily diet consists of mouldy bread, questionable water, and stress. Regardless, you're ill. Time to see the healer. You limp over to Maywin, the village's unofficial doctor, who also happens to be the midwife, bark expert, and local gossip. She greets you with a kind smile and a bucket of something steaming. You ask what it is. She says not to worry. That's never a good sign. First, she smears you in mud. Not any mud. Sacred mud. She insists it came from a bog where a saint once sneezed. You're not sure how one confirms that, but you're already halfway coated, and it's too late to back out now. Next comes the herbal compress, a mix of nettle, moss, and something that smells like despair. She slaps it on your forehead and mutters a chant. You try to stay respectful, but it sounds suspiciously like the lyrics to a tavern song. Then she pulls out the leeches. Of course, they're meant to balance your humours, which you did not realise were out of balance. You thought your only humour was mild sarcasm, but apparently your spleen is angry and your bile is staging a coup. She places the leeches on your feet, your arms, and, disturbingly, your ear. You're told not to flinch. You flinch. One falls into your tunic. Maywin assures you this is a sign of healing. You begin to suspect she just enjoys this. Once the leeches are full and your faith is rattled, she gives you a talisman made of straw, teeth, and possibly someone's old button. You're to wear it until the fever breaks or the moon turns red, whichever comes first. Lastly, she recommends prayers. Lots of them. To saints you've never heard of, and one particularly moody river spirit. You oblige. You can't afford to offend either medicine or water sources right now. You return home, caked in mud, mildly blood-drained, and spiritually confused. You still feel sick, but now you also feel traditional. In Dark Age Britain, healthcare isn't about cures. It's about hope, superstition, and creative applications of swamp materials. And hey, if you survive, it was clearly divine intervention. You smell earthy, and that's on a good day. In Dark Age Britain, bathing is less a routine and more a vague memory. You have bathed before, probably. Once when you were 7 and fell into a river. Once when the healer said you needed to clean your aura. Once when a chicken pooped on your head and your mother insisted. But generally, you avoid it, not because you're lazy. It's logistics. First, water must be fetched from a well, which is half a mile away, and guarded by a goose with a vengeance arc. Then it must be boiled, cooled, and poured into a wooden tub you technically share with 5 family members, 2 cousins, and a goat that won't stop watching. Soap exists, kind of. It's made from animal fat and ash, and it smells like betrayal. It technically cleans you, but it also burns your eyes, your dignity, and your soul. Your neighbours don't judge you for skipping baths. They do too. You all operate under the unspoken agreement that everyone smells, so no one brings it up. Like the strange stains on the village elder's robe, or the rumour that he talks to mushrooms. If you do bathe, it's usually a dry rub with moss or a splash in a stream when no one's looking. Because if someone does catch you bathing, they'll assume you're either possessed or trying to seduce someone. Possibly both. The monks bathe more often, which is suspicious, but they have access to better water, probably because they prayed for plumbing. You considered joining the monastery once, but the vow of silence sounded easier than the vow of celibacy. And yet, somehow, you survive. Your skin toughens. Your immune system levels up like a warrior in a tavern brawl. You've inhaled enough dirt to be 4% soil by mass, and frankly, you think that's part of the charm. When the rains come, you might stand outside and pretend it's on purpose. Just don't do it too long, or someone will accuse you of performing a ritual, and then it's a whole thing involving chickens, Latin, and mild public shaming. So yes, you bathe. Occasionally, dramatically, and under duress. But in a world where hygiene is optional and fleas are family, smelling bad is just part of the ambience. Congratulations, you've moved up in the world. You're not a peasant anymore. You're something else. A minor noble, a well-connected thegn, a cousin to the guy who owns the only functioning mill in the county? Who knows? Titles are vague, but what matters is, you now own 2 tunics. This is wealth. You've got a hall instead of a hut. It leaks slightly less. The floor is still dirt, but now it's decorative dirt. You even have rushes, sprinkled with lavender if you're feeling bold, or stale barley if your servant accidentally raided the ale stock. Speaking of servants, you now have people to do things for you. like turning your animal dung into fertilizer, or throwing bathwater out the window so you don't have to aim it yourself. Power, truly, is measured in how little mud you have to touch with your own feet. Your meals are slightly fancier. Instead of barley stew, you get barley stew with herbs. Maybe even a hint of salted pork, if the pigs weren't mysteriously borrowed by Vikings again. You have a wooden spoon that isn't shared with the goat, but despite all this lavish splendor, you still stink. Everyone does. You have more access to water than the peasants, but also more fur-lined cloaks, sweat-soaked armor, and feasts that involve an uncomfortable amount of cheese and mead. Bathing is a seasonal event, like harvest festivals or surprise Viking raids. Your local priest assures you that God loves humility, and what's more humble than smelling like a damp blanket left in a barn? Cleanliness may be next to godliness, but in your case, next to is separated by a rather pungent moat. Perfume exists, technically, imported from distant lands or cobbled together by your healer using flowers and deer glands. It helps a little. Now you smell like a sweaty meadow instead of just sweat. Progress. Still, peasants admire you. They imagine you dine on gold plates and sleep in feather beds. You do neither, mostly because you're paranoid about being poisoned or stabbed in your sleep by your third cousin. In short, life at the top in Dark Age Britain is better. Just not by modern standards. You're still one bad winter away from wearing a badger for warmth and calling it fashion. But hey, at least you have options. Let's be honest. You can't read. You also can't write, or count past whatever number of fingers and toes you haven't lost to frostbite. But that's okay. Nobody expects you to. You're not a monk, you're not royalty, you're not even an Ethelred, and let's face it, if you were, you'd be too busy trying not to be the unready to bother with books. In Dark Age Britain, education is a luxury, like socks that match, or a winter without dysentery. The only people who get to learn things are monks, nuns, and the occasional noble child who can sit still long enough to not eat the parchment. Monks, of course, are the nerds of the age. They know Latin, Greek, astronomy, and how to draw suspiciously muscular angels in the margins of manuscripts. They live in cold stone buildings, write all day, and pretend to enjoy boiled cabbage. They insist knowledge is power. You suspect they just want an excuse not to shovel pig dung. You, however, are part of the 99% who think grammar is the name of the village herb witch. You've seen writing. It's on the priest's scrolls. It looks like tiny chicken footprints marching across a page. He claims it says important things. Biblical truths, divine laws, sermons. But for all you know, it could just be his shopping list and a few doodles of St. Cuthbert riding a dragon. The concept of school doesn't exist in your world. There's no one shouting pop quiz, just someone shouting, probably because a boar got into the grain again. Your education comes from three sources: your parents, who mostly teach survival, the local elder, who mostly teaches superstition, and life itself, which teaches pain in bulk. That said, you are clever. You've memorized when the rains come. You know how to barter with someone who's missing most of their teeth. You can gut a fish blindfolded. You can identify herbs that won't kill you. That's a kind of literacy too, just not the parchment and quill kind. So no, you can't recite Cicero, but you can fight off wolves with a stick and win an argument with a drunk pig farmer. In Dark Age Britain, that's more useful than algebra anyway. You don't have Netflix. You don't even have puppets, unless you count your cousin Edda making shadow animals on the wall while mildly intoxicated on turnip ale. But you do have gossip. And fire. And when the sun goes down and the work is done, or at least postponed until your back stops screaming, the village gathers around the hearth to indulge in both. Entertainment in Dark Age Britain is deeply analogue. There's no screen time, just scream time. A big communal fire crackling in the centre of a smoky hall is your cinema, your theatre, your radio, and your talk stage all in one. It's hot, smoky, and if you sit too close, your eyebrows may become optional. But it's where stories live. Someone will inevitably start a tale, usually involving ancient kings, sacred stones, or a farmer who tried to milk the wrong end of a cow. Someone else will interrupt halfway through to say, "That's not how my grandmother told it." And then an entirely new version will begin, starring a druid, a pig, and 3 regrettable marriages. Meanwhile, the village's unofficial drama department, the gossips, will circle like vultures around a carcass of scandal. Did you hear that Wulfstan's daughter was seen by the river with that monk? Did you see the way the blacksmith's wife touched the baker's arm? Did anyone else notice that the new baby looks suspiciously like that visiting piper? There's no written press, but trust, the village rumour mill is so efficient it would make Twitter blush. Musicians occasionally appear, playing on something vaguely resembling a harp or a tortured cat. People clap, not necessarily out of enjoyment, but because rhythm is a form of social survival. Dancing may occur, especially after mead. It is less choreography and more flailing with purpose. If things get really wild, there's a riddle contest, or someone challenges a neighbour to arm wrestling with a live chicken. This is considered high culture, but truly, nothing beats a night around the fire. The warmth, the laughter, the subtle glances that say, "If you tell anyone what I said about Ethelfrith, I will bury you behind the compost." Because in Dark Age Britain, there are no secrets, only stories waiting to be exaggerated. You wake up wet, again. You're not sure if it rained, if the roof is leaking, or if the condensation from the collective breath of 5 humans and 2 goats has created indoor weather. Regardless, your blanket, made from scratchy wool and poor decisions, is damp, and so is your spirit. In Dark Age Britain, the weather is less a background feature and more of a recurring villain. It doesn't just happen to you, it hunts you. The rain is not romantic. It is a cold, stinging, morale-destroying deluge that laughs as it soaks through your cloak, your boots, and eventually, your very soul. You have roughly 3 seasons: mud, slightly less mud, and surprise frostbite. Summer exists, technically, but usually arrives like a confused guest at a funeral. Brief, inappropriate, and followed by thunder. Wind is a daily visitor, rattling your thatched roof like it's trying to whisper secrets. It enters every hole in your clothes and every crevice of your house. It's not a breeze. It's a force of nature with opinions and unresolved anger. Snow is even worse. When it falls, you're tempted to lie down in it and give up. It's pretty for about 3 seconds before it melts just enough to become slush, refreezes, and then tries to break your ankles when you step outside. You've learned that clouds aren't just a thing in the sky. They're a mood. When they roll in, your joints ache, your animals get jumpy, and someone inevitably mutters, "It's going to be a bad one." You're not sure what it is, but it's always bad. There's no forecast, of course. The sky is your weatherman, and your weatherman is drunk, angry, and inconsistent. You sometimes try to interpret omens. The way the birds fly, how the pigs behave, or how loudly your neighbour complains about his knees. None of these are reliable, but they're more accurate than the monk who swears by moon phases and goat entrails. Still, despite all this, you persist. You dry your socks over a fire, wring out your cloak, and trudge through the slop with the grim determination of someone who knows the alternative is worse. Because in Dark Age Britain, the weather may be trying to kill you, but so is everything else, and at least the weather doesn't charge rent. You don't marry for love. You marry because your father owns 6 goats, and your future in-laws own 5, and if everything goes well, together they'll produce a small army of bleating, milk-leaking dowry machines. Welcome to Romance Dark Age style. Your courtship lasts roughly as long as it takes to finish a bowl of porridge. You meet your spouse on the same day you exchange vows, which are less "till death do us part," and more "please don't die of dysentery before we've had at least 1 child." Love? That's something poets whisper about, probably in Latin. You, meanwhile, are busy learning to tolerate someone who chews loudly and forgets to wash their feet. Daily. The ceremony itself is modest. Just you, your betrothed, a nervous priest, and an enthusiastic crowd of family members pretending this union isn't mostly about land rights. You exchange oaths, possibly rings, and definitely livestock. Then you're off to the marital hut, which is just like your old hut. Except now it contains even more emotional complexity and 1 fewer exit route. The wedding night is awkward, brief, and closely monitored by relatives who nod approvingly when the deed is confirmed with a stained bedsheet. Privacy is a luxury reserved for nobles and hermits. From there, the relationship blossoms into logistics. Together, you raise pigs, patch roofs, and argue about who left the firewood out in the rain. You have children, partly out of joy, mostly because your village's mortality rate makes it statistically necessary to have at least 8 to end up with 3. If your partner dies, and they probably will, from anything ranging from plague to tripped over a chicken and fell into a well, you remarry with all the emotional ceremony of trading boots. Mourn briefly, then move on. There's barley to harvest. Still, in the quiet moments, there might be affection, a shared laugh, a look across the hearth, a warm bowl of stew offered without being asked. These small mercies, like everything else in Dark Age Britain, are rare, fleeting, and treasured. Because while marriage may be practical, survival is romantic enough on its own. Your ideal death scenario? Falling asleep beside a warm fire, belly full of stew, perhaps surrounded by children who look vaguely like you. Maybe one even becomes a monk and scribbles your name in a dusty manuscript. Edric, who lived, farmed, and passed peacefully, winter of 841. What you'll probably get? Trampled by a runaway ox, or stabbed during a Viking raid while still half asleep and wearing one shoe. In Dark Age Britain, dying quietly in bed is the lottery win of fates. Most people go out like a dropped sack of oats. Suddenly, inconveniently, and with minimal dignity. There's plague, famine, axe wounds, infected splinters, childbirth, and the ever-popular mysterious fever that shows up, boils you alive from the inside, and then politely disappears into the fog. War? That's for nobles mostly. You, being a professional goat-counting peasant, try to avoid anything involving swords unless it's to chase off a wolf. But war doesn't care if you're a soldier. It marches into your village, burns your thatch, and helps itself to your stew. The warriors, when they do die, rarely go quietly. It's all screaming, bleeding, and dramatically dropping a sword while monologuing about vengeance. Even the kings don't fare much better. Most of them die mid-uprising, poisoned by an ambitious nephew, or by accidentally falling off something high after dinner. And yet, there's a strange romance in it all. The bards love a good death, especially if it's confusing. He died bravely, choking on a fishbone while singing of glory, they'll say. Your actual death probably involves mud, poor lighting, and someone yelling, "Fetch the leeches!" The monks claim you should die with a clean soul. You're not entirely sure what that means, but just to be safe, you've confessed to things you didn't even do, like stealing Brother Cuthbert's apples. You did. They were sour anyway. In the end, all you want is for someone to remember your name. Maybe carve it into a stone, or mumble it at a feast. You've survived frost, famine, and the neighbour who coughs blood in your direction every spring. So yes, you'd like to die peacefully, preferably in your sleep, and not while screaming in a burning granary during a misunderstanding with the Danes. Night falls in Dark Age Britain like a damp wool blanket, itchy, heavy, and slightly suspicious smelling. You bank the hearth fire carefully, knowing full well that if the last ember dies before dawn, you'll wake up with frost in your eyebrows and the joyful realization that your nose has frozen shut again. You tuck yourself under a rough wool blanket, beside someone snoring like a wounded boar, and try to ignore the constant scratching sound coming from the thatch above. Mice? Spirits? Probably both. The floor is packed dirt. The roof leaks on Tuesdays. The wind whistles through every crack with the enthusiasm of a bard 3 ales deep. You try to sleep, curled like a salted fish, wondering if tomorrow might be marginally less awful. Maybe the pig won't escape. Maybe the priest won't lecture you for sneezing during Mass. Maybe you'll find that comb you lost last spring. Unlikely. But hope is free and you're poor, so it's your best investment. You replay the day in your head. You collected dung, stepped in more dung, traded a turnip for something vaguely edible, and tried to avoid both your neighbour and his unsolicited opinions on proper chicken rotation. You fought a goose. The goose won. There's a dull ache in your legs, a sharper one in your pride, and a deep spiritual exhaustion reserved for people who still aren't sure what century it is. But hey, you lived another day. That's worth something. Outside, wolves howl. Or maybe that's your cousin Wolfstan after too much mead. Either way, you pull the blanket tighter and try to drift off. You dream of a better world, one with soap, literacy, and bread that doesn't contain gravel. In your dreams, you own 2 pairs of shoes and eat something that wasn't boiled in despair. Will tomorrow be different? Probably not. But you'll get up anyway. Because you always do. Because in Dark Age Britain, survival is its own quiet rebellion. You're not a hero. You're not a legend. You're not even literate. But you endure. And that, somehow, is enough. If you were a medieval peasant, your daily meals were less about variety and more about survival. Every morning might begin with a rough porridge, sometimes called pottage, a thick, unappetizing stew of oats or barley boiled in water. It was filling, yes, but hardly exciting. Flavour was a luxury you couldn't afford. A pinch of onion, garlic, or cabbage thrown in was as close to seasoning as most peasants ever got. Salt, considered ordinary today, was so expensive that it was used sparingly, reserved for preserving food rather than improving taste. Bread was the cornerstone of your diet, but not the fluffy white loaf we picture now. Instead, you ate coarse, heavy black bread, made from rye, barley, or whatever grain could be ground into flour. It was dense, dark, and sometimes even mixed with ground beans, acorns, or peas to stretch it further. Fresh bread was rare. More often, slices from yesterday's loaf were used as makeshift plates, known as trenchers. These hunks of stale bread soaked up broth or meat juices if you were lucky enough to get any. And when the meal ended, the sodden trencher might be eaten or tossed to the dogs. Meat was scarce on the peasant's table, often appearing only during feast days or festivals. The average villager couldn't dream of eating beef or pork regularly. Livestock were too valuable alive, producing milk, eggs, or wool. Chickens might be slaughtered occasionally, but more often they were kept for their eggs. In times of desperation, peasants sometimes trapped small game or ate whatever could be foraged: mushrooms, berries, or even tree bark boiled down in grim famines. Fish, on the other hand, could occasionally be found in rivers and ponds, though catching them without permission from a lord's land was illegal and punishable. Still, hunger often pushed peasants into risky ventures, sneaking into woodlands to snare rabbits, or fishing in forbidden waters. What tied all of this together was uncertainty. Your meals depended on the harvest, and when the rains failed or blight struck, the spectre of famine loomed large. During these dark times, pottage became thinner, bread smaller, and the gnawing ache of hunger more familiar. For peasants, eating wasn't about pleasure. It was about making it through another day. While peasants scraped by on porridge and black bread, the nobility dined in a world that seemed almost fantastical by comparison. At a lord's table, food wasn't merely about nourishment, it was about wealth, status, and the spectacle of abundance. A banquet was a chance to impress guests, reinforce power, and remind everyone of the hierarchy that defined medieval society. The menu for nobles was dominated by meat, something peasants rarely touched. Beef, pork, venison, and mutton appeared regularly, roasted on great spits over open fires. Game birds, pheasants, partridges, swans, and even peacocks were prized for their rarity and prestige. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for a roasted bird to be redressed in its colourful feathers after cooking, presented at the table as a dazzling centrepiece. This wasn't just food, it was theatre. Pies were another staple of aristocratic dining. But these weren't the sweet fruit pies familiar to us today. Medieval pies were hearty, filled with minced meat, spices, and sometimes dried fruits. The pastry coffin that held them wasn't always intended to be eaten. It often served as a cooking vessel or container to transport the filling. For the wealthy, these pies were symbols of ingenuity and excess. stuffed with combinations of flavors unimaginable to the poor. Spices made the difference between a noble's feast and a peasant's meal. Imported from the Middle East and Asia through long, dangerous trade routes, spices such as pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and saffron were staggeringly expensive. To season a dish with them was to announce one's wealth to the entire hall. The noble palate became accustomed to sweet and savory combinations, with meats seasoned with sugar, dried fruits, and aromatic herbs. The medieval aristocracy loved bold, complex flavors that would have been entirely alien to the common folk. But dining wasn't just about the food. It was about ritual. Meals were served in courses, accompanied by music, dancing, and entertainment. Servants carried in dishes on silver platters, and strict etiquette dictated who sat where and who was served first. The lord and lady ate at the high table, visible to all, while lesser guests occupied places of decreasing importance down the hall. Even eating was a performance of hierarchy. For nobles, food was indulgence, identity, and display. Where the peasant's bowl was filled with survival, the noble's platter overflowed with theatre. In the Middle Ages, the church wasn't just a spiritual authority. It shaped what people ate, when they ate, and even how they thought about food. One of the clearest examples was the strict regulation of meat consumption. According to Christian doctrine, Fridays, along with Lent and other holy days, were days of fasting from meat. But fasting didn't necessarily mean going hungry. It meant turning to alternatives, most famously fish. For peasants, this often meant salted or dried fish, preserved in barrels for the long haul from coastal fisheries. It wasn't glamorous, but it fulfilled the requirement of abstaining from meat. Wealthier households, however, had access to a staggering variety of aquatic life: freshwater pike, carp, and eels from rivers, as well as herring, cod, and sturgeon brought inland from the sea. The wealthy even dined on delicacies like oysters and lampreys, considered luxuries at the medieval table. Monasteries, bound by the strictest fasting rules, became centres of fish production. Many abbeys constructed elaborate fish ponds, ensuring a steady supply year-round. The monks, unsurprisingly, grew creative. They classified certain animals as fish to bend the rules, beavers because of their tails, and even barnacle geese, which were said to grow from driftwood on the seashore, were deemed acceptable fasting food. It sounds absurd to us, but it reveals how central faith was to shaping medieval diet. Fish wasn't merely a religious substitute, it was also a symbol of purity. In a world where fresh meat often spoiled quickly, fish represented the ability to follow divine law while displaying wealth and discipline. Salted herring became a cornerstone of trade, especially in northern Europe, fueling the prosperity of cities like Lübeck and Bruges. In fact, the medieval economy of entire regions thrived on the need for fish during fasting days, yet not everyone enjoyed it. To many peasants, dried herring was monotonous, tough, and sometimes barely edible. For nobles, however, fish became another stage for extravagance. Sauces flavoured with exotic spices or sweetened with sugar transformed it into a dish of luxury rather than obligation. The church's dietary laws left no one untouched. Whether you were a ploughman chewing on salted herring, or a noble savouring sturgeon glazed with cinnamon, your plate was a reflection of faith. In the Middle Ages, what you ate wasn't just about survival, it was about salvation. If there was one drink that united both peasants and nobles in the Middle Ages, it was ale. Not water, not milk, but ale. The reason was simple. Water was often unsafe to drink. Wells could be contaminated, streams filled with waste, and stagnant ponds carried disease. Brewing ale, however, required boiling water, which killed off harmful bacteria. So, whether you were a farmer in a thatched cottage or a baron in a stone hall, ale flowed at your table from dawn to dusk. For peasants, this meant small ale, a weak, low-alcohol brew consumed daily, even by children. It was nourishing, hydrating, and safer than the village well. Families brewed it at home, often with whatever grains were available. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept thirst at bay. Brewing was usually women's work. Alewives could even earn a living selling their surplus to neighbours, making ale one of the earliest female-dominated trades in medieval society. Nobles, of course, had stronger, richer versions at their feasts. Ale could be dark, thick, and hearty, or flavoured with herbs like bog myrtle, yarrow, or heather in the days before hops became common in Europe. Imported wines also graced noble tables, especially in regions close to trade routes with France, Italy, and Spain. But even in great halls, ale remained a staple, poured from massive pitchers into pewter goblets as minstrels played and jesters entertained. Drinking was more than hydration. It was social glue. Alehouses dotted villages and towns, serving as the medieval equivalent of the local pub. Here, peasants gathered to gossip, strike deals, or relax after a day in the fields. Laws were even passed to regulate the strength and quality of ale, with official tasters, known as ale conners, roaming from tavern to tavern to make sure brewers weren't cheating customers. Of course, heavy drinking came with consequences. Chronic drunkenness was mocked in plays, chastised in sermons, and feared by wives whose husbands squandered wages in alehouses. Yet despite the warnings, the culture of ale endured. To refuse a drink might even seem suspicious, as though you were rejecting hospitality itself. Ale was more than a beverage. It was survival, community, and comfort. From the humblest cottage to the grandest castle, the clink of mugs and the froth of ale connected medieval people across class lines. In a world of uncertainty, one thing was certain. The Middle Ages were awash in ale. In the Middle Ages, nothing announced wealth more clearly than the use of spices. For the vast majority of peasants, food was plain, earthy, and repetitive. But in noble kitchens, spices transformed meals into exotic experiences. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, and saffron turned ordinary meat into extraordinary feasts, while pepper, the most prized of all, was so valuable it was sometimes used as currency. These flavours did not come cheaply. They travelled thousands of miles along perilous trade routes from Asia and the Middle East. Merchants braved deserts, seas, and bandits to bring small sacks of peppercorns or sticks of cinnamon into Europe. By the time these reached a noble's pantry, their price had soared beyond imagination. A handful of saffron could cost as much as a horse, while a pound of pepper was worth more than a labourer's yearly wage. To sprinkle spices liberally at a banquet was to declare without words, "I can afford the world." But spices weren't only about flavour, they carried symbolic meaning. Medieval medicine, rooted in the theory of the four humours, taught that foods influence the body's balance of hot, cold, wet, and dry. Spices were considered hot and dry, thought to stimulate digestion and protect against illness. Physicians recommended them for stomach troubles, fevers, and even melancholy. Nobles, eager to display both refinement and health, leaned heavily into spice-laden dishes. Recipes from aristocratic cookbooks reveal just how complex medieval cuisine could be. Meat might be stewed with cinnamon and sugar, fish flavoured with ginger and raisins, or sauces thickened with almonds and saffron. Sweet and savoury pairings, which seem unusual to modern tastes, were common and highly prized. To a peasant, the idea of eating rabbit in a sauce of wine, honey, and cloves would have been unthinkable, both for cost and imagination. Spices also carried a mystical allure. They came from lands barely understood by Europeans, associated with the distant Orient and the legends of silk, incense, and gold. Their presence on the table was as much about storytelling as it was about eating, each pinch a reminder of distant lands and dangerous journeys. For nobles, spices were more than condiments. They were jewels of the kitchen, tokens of global connection, and declarations of dominance. To own them was to control a luxury that few in Europe ever even smelled. For peasants, meanwhile, spice remained a rumour, something whispered about, but almost never tasted. Life in the Middle Ages was never stable when it came to food. The rhythm of the seasons dictated whether people dined in abundance or suffered in scarcity. In good years, barns overflowed with grain, herds were healthy, and markets bustled with produce. But when the rains failed, Frosts lingered, or disease struck crops and livestock. Famine spread like a shadow across the land. For peasants, these swings between feast and famine were most brutal. A successful harvest meant hearty pottage with beans, leeks, and perhaps even scraps of bacon to flavour the pot. Bread loaves could be baked in bulk and stored, and the village might celebrate with an occasional communal feast, roasting an ox or sheep for everyone to share. Festivals like harvest time or religious holy days provided rare moments of plenty, where even the poorest bellies were briefly full, but in bad years, survival strategies grew desperate. With fields failing, people turned to substitutes. Acorns ground into meal, weeds boiled into bitter soups, and even the bark of trees peeled and eaten in extremity. Chroniclers describe peasants scavenging for roots and grasses, while noble lords retreated into their storerooms, rationing out preserved grains and salted meats. Starvation sharpened class divides, reminding everyone who had control over the land and its produce. Nobles were not immune to scarcity, but they had resources to cushion the blow. Their pantries held salted hams, smoked fish, and barrels of preserved fruits, lasting through lean months. They could also import goods from other regions when local harvests failed. Yet even castles felt the pressure when famine spread widely. Feasts grew smaller, spices more carefully measured, and meat less freely offered to guests. Religion also played into the rhythm of feast and famine. Lent and fasting periods were enforced across all classes, deliberately reducing rich food intake and stretching supplies. This rhythm of restraint was followed by bursts of indulgence during feasts like Easter or Christmas, when the tables overflowed with roasted meats, pies, and puddings. The cycle of denial and reward was woven into the medieval experience of eating. Ultimately, medieval diets were shaped as much by uncertainty as by tradition. Food was fragile, vulnerable to the whims of weather, war, and plague. In a single year, one village might celebrate abundance while another starved. To live in the Middle Ages was to live at the mercy of both the soil and the sky, feasting one month and fasting the next. If noble halls dazzled with display and peasant huts scraped by with survival, monasteries offered a very different relationship with food. For monks and nuns, meals were less about indulgence and more about discipline, food as fuel for prayer, contemplation, and service to God. Yet even within this simplicity, monastic diets reveal much about medieval life. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided many monastic communities, emphasized moderation. Meals were to be plain, frugal, and taken in silence. Meat from four-legged animals was often forbidden, with fish, eggs, cheese, and vegetables serving as the primary sources of nourishment. Bread and ale, of course, remained staples. Monks typically ate twice a day, once at midday, and again in the evening, though fasting days reduced this to a single meal. The idea was not to starve, but to curb gluttony and keep the body humble before God. Food was eaten in the refectory, a large communal dining hall. Silence was enforced, and instead of chatter, one monk read aloud from scripture or the writings of saints. This turned meals into spiritual exercises, reminding the brethren that even eating could serve a higher purpose. The act of consumption was sanctified by ritual, reinforcing the monastery's rhythm of prayer, labour, and restraint. Monasteries also became famous for their innovations in food production. To sustain themselves, monks maintained orchards, vineyards, gardens, and fish ponds. These self-sufficient systems allowed monasteries to flourish even during times of famine. In fact, some of the earliest developments in brewing and cheesemaking came from monastic communities whose skill and discipline produced goods valued across Europe. Beer brewed by monks was clean, nourishing, and reliable. Centuries later, some of those traditions still survive in Trappist ales. Of course, human nature crept in. Records show that some monasteries bent the rules, interpreting no meat as no beef or pork, while happily consuming poultry. Wealthier abbeys, flush with donations, sometimes enjoyed meals that looked suspiciously like noble feasts, complete with spiced fish and elaborate pastries. These excesses drew criticism, but they also reflected how even sacred spaces were not immune to the temptations of comfort and status. Ultimately, monastic meals represented an ideal: simplicity, discipline, and devotion. Food was not meant to distract from God, but to support a life dedicated to Him. In a world of hunger and indulgence, the monastery carved out a unique middle path where every bite was both nourishment and prayer. In the Middle Ages, what you ate wasn't just about filling your stomach. It was about telling the world who you were. Food reinforced social hierarchy as clearly as clothing, castles, or land ownership. Every meal was a silent declaration of rank. For peasants, the food on the table was basic, coarse, and repetitive. Their meals declared poverty, but also resilience. Porridge, black bread, beans, and seasonal vegetables were not only the cheapest sustenance, but also the food of necessity. If a peasant was seen eating meat too often, it might raise suspicion. Was he poaching from the Lord's land, or flaunting resources he shouldn't have? Even in diet, peasants had to keep within invisible boundaries. Nobles, by contrast, built their identities around abundance and excess. A medieval lord's feast was theatre designed to awe both guests and dependents. Elaborate banquets showcased exotic meats, sugar sculptures, and spice-heavy sauces. Wealth wasn't just tasted, it was displayed. For a noble to dine simply might risk whispers of weakness. Even the choice of drink, fine imported wine for nobles, weak ale for peasants, reinforced the gulf between classes. Clergy occupied a complex middle ground. Monks were supposed to eat modestly, but wealthy monasteries sometimes grew notorious for their indulgence. Bishops and abbots dined closer to nobles than peasants, their tables filled with fish, wine, and pastries. To eat richly was to mirror the grandeur of the church itself. In this way, religious and social status intertwined through food. Etiquette also played its part. At noble tables, strict rules determined who sat where, who was served first, and what portions were appropriate. A lord at the high table carved his meat with ceremony, while lesser guests received smaller cuts. At the bottom of the hall, servants and retainers ate simpler dishes, leftovers of the feast above them. Even within a single dining room, hierarchy was etched onto the plate. Food also became a tool of control. Lords distributed grain to peasants during lean years, reinforcing dependence. Hospitality itself was political. To feed guests generously was to show power, while to deny food was to assert dominance. In essence, food was a currency of authority. In the medieval world, diet was identity. The contents of your bowl or platter told others not just what you could afford, but who you were, where you belonged, and how much respect you commanded. When we look back at the food of the Middle Ages, it's tempting to see it as primitive. Heavy bread, bland pottage, and endless ale. Yet, the medieval table laid the foundations for much of Europe's culinary identity. Many of the habits, tastes, and even superstitions born in that era still echo in our kitchens today. The reliance on bread, for instance, never faded. Though peasants once ate coarse black loaves, while nobles favoured finer white bread, both rich and poor shared in the central role of grain. Even now, bread is still treated as a staple in European diets, a direct descendant of that medieval reliance. Ale too left its mark. Though modern brewing has transformed into a global industry, its roots stretch back to the small-scale production of medieval alewives and the disciplined brewing of monks. Every sip of beer today carries a whisper of that history. Spices, once jewels of the table, reshaped Europe forever. The obsession with pepper, cinnamon, and cloves fueled exploration and trade, setting in motion the great voyages of discovery that connected continents. The medieval noble sprinkling saffron on a dish could not have known he was part of a chain leading to the opening of sea routes, colonization, and the global spice trade that still shapes economies. Food was not just survival, it was a force that drove history. The Church's influence also lingers. The tradition of fish on Fridays, born of medieval fasting rules, continues among Catholics worldwide. It reflects how diet and faith intertwined so deeply that centuries of change could not erase the habit. Meanwhile, medieval fears of famine, etched into cultural memory, left a legacy of preservation. Salting, smoking, pickling, techniques honed out of necessity, still survive as beloved culinary traditions rather than desperate measures. Perhaps most striking is how food highlighted identity and inequality. The gap between peasant porridge and noble feasts reminds us how meals shape social worlds. Even today, luxury foods carry unspoken messages about wealth, power, and belonging, echoing those medieval banquets where a roasted peacock on the table was as much about politics as palate. In the end, the medieval diet was not just about survival, it was about meaning. Every loaf of bread, every cup of ale, every fish pulled from a monastery pond carried with it stories of faith, struggle, hierarchy, and hope. To understand medieval food is to understand the medieval world itself, humble, lavish, devout, and endlessly human. When the Puritans crossed the Atlantic and planted their communities in New England, they carried with them a vision of a society governed by God's law. In their sermons, pamphlets, and household rules, chastity was upheld as a divine command. Sexual intimacy belonged strictly within marriage, and even there it was framed less as pleasure and more as duty, the act of producing godly children to populate the new land. Courtship was expected to be modest, supervised, and directed toward quick marriage, and any hint of lust was condemned as a dangerous crack in the moral foundation of the colony. Yet the surviving records tell a more human story. Despite the fire and brimstone warnings of ministers, desire did not vanish in the cold New England air. In fact, court documents reveal that premarital pregnancy was strikingly common. Historians estimate that in some communities, as many as 1/3 of brides were already expecting a child when they walked down the aisle. The timeline was difficult to deny. Children born less than 9 months after weddings raised eyebrows, and in many cases, the evidence was undeniable. Colonial leaders knew the reality, but balanced it with pragmatism. As long as a couple married before the child was born, communities often looked the other way. A baby arriving a little early was embarrassing, but not ruinous. What mattered most was the preservation of marriage as an institution. If young people stumbled, the solution was to marry them quickly, turning scandal into a union that reinforced family and community ties. Still, ministers thundered from the pulpit, warning of damnation for fornication and painting premarital sex as both a sin against God and a threat to the survival of the colony. The contrast between the ideals of purity and the evidence in the record books created a tension that defined colonial sexual culture. People lived in two worlds at once: the world of official morality, shaped by sermons and punishments, and the world of human desire, shaped by whispers, secret meetings, and hurried marriages. This clash between rigid religious ideals and ordinary human realities didn't just create moral debates, it fueled gossip, court cases, and scandals that would echo through the communities of colonial America. In colonial America, courtship was both a personal and a public affair. Young men and women were expected to choose their partners carefully, not only for affection, but also for the stability of family, property, and community reputation. Yet, within this careful process, one curious and controversial practice flourished: bundling. Bundling allowed courting couples to spend the night together in the same bed, seemingly shocking to modern ears. But in the Puritan colonies, it was considered a compromise between strict morality and youthful desire. The young man and woman would lie together fully clothed, or with a wooden board placed between them, or sometimes wrapped tightly in separate sacks, meant to prevent physical intimacy. The idea was to give couples private time to talk, bond, and build trust, without crossing the line into sin. But human nature rarely followed the rules. Communities that tolerated bundling often saw predictable results: a rise in premarital pregnancies. Colonial birth records show many children born suspiciously early after their parents' wedding, and letters and diaries hint at the quiet acceptance of these situations. The practice, though officially frowned upon, was often overlooked because it was practical. Courtship was hard in small rural towns, where homes were cramped and travel was difficult. Bundling gave couples rare privacy, and parents often accepted it as long as marriage quickly followed. Of course, not everyone approved. Ministers railed against bundling, describing it as a dangerous temptation and a slippery slope toward fornication. Moralists saw it as evidence of weakening spiritual discipline, while gossips in the village whispered about which couples had taken bundling too far. Yet like many colonial customs, it survived precisely because it fit into the realities of daily life. In practice, bundling represented the blurry line between ideal and reality. Officially, it was about restraint. Two people talking into the night about marriage, their lives wrapped in wool blankets and faith. But in reality, it often tested the boundaries of chastity, and sometimes those boundaries collapsed. When a young woman became pregnant, the expectation was clear. The couple must marry, and quickly. Thus, bundling became both a symbol of Puritan compromise and a source of scandal. It showed how colonial society tried to control desire, but also how desire found its way around wooden boards and sackcloth barriers. Marriage in colonial America was far more than a romantic union. It was the foundation of society itself. To the Puritans, marriage was ordained by God, not simply for companionship, but for order, labor, and the continuation of the community. The household was seen as a little commonwealth, where the husband acted as governor, the wife as helpmate, and children as obedient subjects. Without stable marriages, colonial leaders feared society would collapse into chaos. Courtship, though sometimes affectionate, was highly practical. A man's prospects as a husband were judged by his ability to provide land, tools, or a trade. A woman's value was measured in her skills. Could she manage a household, cook, preserve food, weave, or raise children? Love was desirable but secondary. Marriages were often arranged with family interests in mind, strengthening alliances between farms, shops, or political networks. Once married, women were legally and socially subordinate to their husbands. The doctrine of coverture meant that a wife's identity was absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property independently, sign contracts, or bring lawsuits on her own. In practice, however, women exercised considerable influence inside the household. They managed farms while husbands travelled, ran shops, brewed ale, and oversaw food production. Many colonial households depended on women's labour as much as men's authority. Divorce was rare, but not impossible. In New England, where Puritan leaders controlled the courts, divorce could be granted in cases of adultery, desertion, bigamy, or extreme cruelty. The records reveal surprising cases: women petitioning to leave violent husbands, men accusing wives of infidelity, or spouses abandoning families and vanishing into the frontier. Still, these cases were exceptions. Most couples remained bound together, whether happily or not, because marriage was too central to be dissolved lightly. Marriage also served as a moral safeguard. Authorities believed that without marriage, men and women would fall into sexual sin. Ministers preached that wedlock was the only proper channel for desire. Yet, the same records that idealized marriage also exposed cracks in its facade. Adultery, abandonment, and abuse were not uncommon, and scandals involving respected families sometimes rocked entire towns. In short, marriage in colonial America was both sacred and practical. It structured society, ensured economic survival, and reinforced gender hierarchies. But behind the sermons and contracts lay complex human relationships, filled with affection, conflict, compromise, and at times public scandal. Few offences stirred as much fear and fascination in colonial America as adultery. The Puritans considered it not only a sin against God, but also a direct threat to the stability of the community. Marriage was the cornerstone of order, and any betrayal of that bond risked unravelling the fabric of society. Sermons thundered that adultery was second only to murder in seriousness, and colonial laws reflected this severity. In 17th century Massachusetts, adultery was technically a capital crime, punishable by death, though in practice executions were rare. Instead, most offenders faced humiliating punishments. Adulterers could be publicly whipped, fined heavily, or forced to wear badges of shame. Branding was sometimes used, burning a letter A into the flesh. More often, however, the punishment took the form of humiliation, such as standing on the scaffold before the community while neighbours jeered. This practice not only punished the sinner, but also served as a warning to others, reinforcing communal values. Long before Nathaniel Hawthorne imagined Hester Prynne and her scarlet letter, real men and women in New England were already enduring such marks of disgrace. Despite the threats, adultery persisted. Colonial court records reveal numerous cases, often entangling prominent families. Affairs were not limited to the reckless or poor. They crossed all social classes. In some towns, entire communities were enthralled by the details of trials, where testimony exposed secret meetings in barns, letters exchanged in haste, or whispered rumours that turned into legal evidence. The very intimacy of colonial towns, where everyone knew their neighbour's business, made concealment difficult and scandals quickly spread. Adultery also exposed double standards. Women were more likely to face severe penalties, as female chastity was tied directly to family honour and inheritance. Men, especially of higher status, sometimes escaped with lighter punishments. Still, adultery was dangerous for both sexes. It could destroy reputations, fracture households, and permanently stain family names. These cases reveal a society caught between rigid ideals and human desire. Ministers preached purity, laws promised harsh justice, and yet communities repeatedly dealt with broken vows and exposed secrets. The gap between what the Puritans demanded and what people actually did was vast, and every adultery trial widened it further. In colonial America, adultery was never just a private betrayal. It was a public drama, a courtroom spectacle, and a reminder that beneath the strict moral codes, passion refused to be contained. In modern times, a kiss in public might seem sweet, even romantic, but in colonial America, the very same act could carry the weight of scandal, and in some cases, legal punishment. The Puritans believed that morality was not a private affair, but a public responsibility. If the community tolerated light behaviour, they feared it would invite God's wrath on everyone. As a result, even small gestures of affection between unmarried men and women were policed. Court records from 17th century Massachusetts and Connecticut reveal cases where couples were hauled before magistrates simply for being caught kissing or embracing in public. Some were fined, others whipped, and still others forced to stand in public confession, declaring their shame before their neighbours. To the Puritan eye, a kiss outside of marriage was not innocent. It was a dangerous spark that could ignite full-blown fornication. The anxiety wasn't just about morality, it was also about control. Public affection suggested that private passions could spill out into the open, threatening the order that ministers worked so hard to maintain. If young couples openly displayed desire, it suggested the church's authority was weakening. Leaders worried that such behaviour set a precedent. If a kiss was overlooked, what would come next? Yet despite the prohibitions, young people still found ways to test boundaries. Kisses stolen behind meeting houses, embraces caught during festive gatherings, or even a hand held too long could trigger gossip that quickly spread through tight-knit towns. Colonial communities thrived on surveillance, everyone watched everyone else, and public affection became an easy target for scandal. Interestingly, not all cases were treated with equal severity. A married couple caught kissing in public might be gently scolded for indecency, but unmarried couples faced far harsher consequences. In the Puritan worldview, a husband and wife already had God's sanction. Young lovers did not. And while punishment for kissing might seem absurd today, it reflected the broader Puritan obsession with guarding chastity at every possible stage. These laws reveal how little room colonial society allowed for romance as we imagine it. Love and marriage were framed in terms of duty and discipline, not passion. Yet the persistence of these cases shows that ordinary people still sought affection, despite the risks. In a world where desire was supposed to stay hidden, even a kiss could become a crime. despite the sermons, despite the laws, and despite the constant threat of public punishment, prostitution found its place in colonial America. Wherever there were ports, taverns, and soldiers, there were also women who sold companionship and men who paid for it. It was an open secret, one that moral leaders railed against but never fully eliminated. In bustling port cities like Boston, New York, and Charleston, prostitution was woven into the fabric of urban life. Sailors flush with wages, merchants seeking diversion, and soldiers stationed far from home all created demand. Taverns often doubled as brothels, with rooms upstairs and strong ale downstairs. Prostitution also thrived on the margins of growing towns, in hidden shacks or rented rooms where women took clients discreetly. The colonial authorities did not turn a blind eye. Court records show repeated attempts to prosecute lewd women and shut down houses of ill fame. Punishments ranged from fines to public whipping, and repeat offenders could even face branding. Still, for many women with few economic options, widows, servants dismissed without support, or those escaping abusive households, sex work became a grim form of survival. In societies that left women little control over land or wages, the trade offered money, however dangerous or stigmatized. Moralists portrayed prostitutes as corrupters of men, but the records tell a more complicated story. Many of their clients were men of status, whose names rarely made it into the court documents. Instead, the shame fell disproportionately on women, who were labelled sinners, while their customers slipped back into respectability. Ministers thundered that prostitution would bring down divine punishment, yet the trade persisted quietly in every generation. At times, scandals erupted. Brothels discovered too close to churches or political centres created a stir, and trials for keeping a disorderly house became public spectacles. But more often, prostitution lingered in the background of colonial life, acknowledged yet unspoken. It exposed the tension between the Puritan dream of moral purity and the messy realities of human behaviour. In the end, prostitution was both a scandal and a symptom. It revealed the limits of Puritan control, the vulnerability of women, and the hypocrisy of men who condemned in the pulpit what they sought in the shadows. Like so many aspects of colonial life, it lived in the gap between ideals and reality. Although colonial society prized the stability of marriage above nearly everything else, it was not immune to collapse. Divorce was rare, but it was possible, especially in Puritan New England, where civil courts had authority over marital cases. This was a sharp contrast to England, where divorce was nearly impossible without an Act of Parliament. In the colonies, men and women could petition for divorce under certain circumstances, though the path was fraught with scandal. Adultery was the most common ground. If a wife was found unfaithful, her husband could bring her before the court and seek separation. In some cases, the guilty party was whipped or forced to bear the public shame of punishment before being released from the marriage. Desertion was another frequent reason. Life on the colonial frontier was harsh, and it was not uncommon for husbands, or occasionally wives, to vanish, leaving families behind. After a set period of abandonment, the deserted spouse could petition for legal dissolution. Cruelty also appeared in court records. Women sometimes described beatings, threats, or husbands who withheld food and clothing. Though patriarchal courts were often hesitant to side against men, there are cases where abused wives were granted freedom. These moments reveal a surprising flexibility in a society otherwise rigid about gender roles. Yet, every divorce carried heavy social stigma, branding families with whispers of failure and shame. More common than legal divorce was informal separation. Some couples simply drifted apart, especially in less regulated frontier settlements. A man might leave for trade or war and never return. A woman might move to a new town and remarry without official approval. These situations often created messy disputes over inheritance, property, and legitimacy of children. Even when courts granted divorce, remarriage came with suspicion. Divorced individuals lived under the shadow of scandal, and their new unions were watched closely for signs of impropriety. Ministers warned that broken marriages weakened the community's covenant with God. To end one's marriage was to test the very moral foundations of colonial life. Still, the existence of divorce and desertion cases reveals something important. Despite the heavy sermons and strict laws, colonial marriage was as fragile as any human relationship. It could fracture under pressure, exposing the gap between the Puritan ideal of lifelong unity and the complicated realities of life in the New World. Colonial America was a world where privacy was almost non-existent. In small towns, everyone knew their neighbor's business, and when scandal erupted, it spread like wildfire. Sexual misbehavior, whether premarital pregnancy, adultery, or prostitution, wasn't just a private failing, it was treated as a crime against the entire community. Public shame became the weapon of choice to keep people in line. Punishments were designed not only to correct behavior, but also to humiliate. Offenders might be forced to stand on the public scaffold, whipped before a crowd, or paraded through town with signs declaring their sin. Branding was used for serious crimes, burning letters into the skin, an A for adultery, for example. The purpose was clear: mark the sinner so that their shame could never fully disappear. In some cases, women were forced to wear specific garments or colours, a living reminder of their disgrace. Even minor infractions could trigger scandal. Couples caught kissing in public, young people discovered in suspicious company, or men accused of lewd speech all faced court hearings and fines. Gossip amplified these events, turning individual missteps into communal entertainment. In fact, scandal became a kind of social theatre, reinforcing moral expectations through spectacle. To watch someone punished was to be reminded of the consequences of straying. The reach of shame extended beyond the guilty. Families carried the burden of association, their reputations damaged by the actions of one member. A daughter caught in premarital pregnancy might ruin her siblings' marriage prospects. A husband accused of adultery might cast suspicion on his entire household. In this way, scandal bound everyone together. Each person's morality was believed to affect the community's covenant with God. Yet, there was also a darker side: hypocrisy. While poor or vulnerable people bore the brunt of public punishments, wealthier colonists often found ways to protect themselves. A man of status might escape with a fine, while a servant girl endured lashes. Ministers could thunder about morality on Sunday, and quietly ignore the sins of influential patrons on Monday. Scandal, in other words, revealed not only sexual misconduct, but also the inequalities of colonial justice. Ultimately, scandal was both feared and inevitable. The rigid ideals of purity collided daily with the messy realities of human life. Every whispered rumour, every courtroom trial, and every scarlet punishment showed how fragile the Puritan dream of order really was. In colonial America, sin was never just personal, it was a public performance. When we step back from the sermons, punishments, and courtroom dramas of colonial America, one truth stands out. Sex, marriage, and scandal shaped the very fabric of early society. The Puritans and their neighbours believed they were building a city upon a hill, a model of moral purity. Yet beneath the surface, desire and human frailty constantly undermined those lofty ideals. The strict rules about chastity and marriage were meant to protect more than just individuals. They were designed to safeguard the community. Leaders feared that unchecked sexuality would corrode family life, disrupt inheritance lines, and invite God's judgment. That's why infractions, from kissing in public to adultery, became public matters, prosecuted in court and punished on the scaffold. To modernize, it may seem harsh, but to colonists, morality was communal, not private. At the same time, the records reveal a world far less pure than the Puritan dream. Premarital pregnancies were widespread. Bundling often blurred the line between restraint and temptation, and prostitution thrived wherever soldiers and sailors gathered. Adultery trials filled court dockets, and desertion cases exposed the fragility of marriages under the strain of frontier life. In every colony, human behavior slipped through the cracks of strict regulation, leaving behind a trail of scandal. These contradictions left a lasting legacy. On one hand, the obsession with morality laid the groundwork for later American traditions of public judgment about private behavior. Scandals involving sex, marriage, and reputation would continue to dominate American culture long after the colonial era, from 19th century sermons on fallen women to modern political sex scandals. The idea that private passion could become a public crime did not die with the Puritans. It evolved. On the other hand, the endurance of these scandals also revealed resilience. Despite the sermons, despite the punishments, people still sought love, intimacy, and connection. Women and men bent rules, tested boundaries, and sometimes paid dearly for it, but they also reminded their communities that human nature could not be fully suppressed. Desire, in all its messy reality, was as much a part of colonial America as sermons and stocks. The legacy of colonial love and scandal, then, is twofold. It shows us the weight of control in early America and the persistence of humanity in the face of it. Beneath the wooden boards of bundling, the scarlet letters, and the courtroom trials, colonists were simply people, struggling with the same desires and mistakes that echo across history. Theodora's life began in the shadows of the Hippodrome of Constantinople, the roaring heart of the Byzantine capital, where chariots thundered, crowds cheered, and fortunes rose and fell in a single afternoon. Born around the year 500 CE, she was not destined for palaces or courts, but for a world of hardship. Her father, Acacius, worked as a bear-keeper for the city's entertainment spectacles, training the massive animals that amused and terrified the public. When he died suddenly, Theodora, her sisters and her mother were left adrift, vulnerable in a city where survival depended on connections and coin. Her mother, determined to protect her daughters, brought them to the Hippodrome and begged for help from the performers and factions that controlled its games. According to the sources, she even dressed her children to win sympathy from the crowd. Whether fact or embellishment, the story captures the desperation of Theodora's early life. Survival meant putting oneself on display, turning tragedy into performance. As a child, Theodora was exposed to the underbelly of Byzantine society, where entertainers, dancers, and courtesans carved out precarious lives at the margins of respectability. Acting was no glamorous pursuit. In the Byzantine world, actresses were seen as morally suspect, their profession closely tied to prostitution. It was into this environment that Theodora stepped as she grew older, learning to dance, act, and captivate audiences who cheered one moment and sneered the next. Hostile chroniclers like Procopius, in his Secret History, painted her early life in scandalous terms, portraying her as shameless and depraved. Yet his venom also reveals something else. Theodora had presence. She could command attention, charm an audience, and hold her own in a male-dominated world. The very skills that critics used to shame her, wit, allure, and resilience, would later make her formidable as Empress. Despite the contempt society heaped upon her origins, Theodora's early years gave her a hard-earned education no tutor could have provided. She witnessed firsthand the struggles of the poor, the precariousness of women's lives, and the brutal judgments of a society obsessed with honor and purity. In this crucible of hardship, Theodora developed not just the instinct to survive, but the ambition to rise. What began as a childhood in poverty laid the foundation for one of the most astonishing ascents in imperial history. By the time Theodora entered her teenage years, she was already part of Constantinople's entertainment world, a realm that dazzled the masses, yet condemned its performers. To be an actress in the Byzantine Empire was to live with a permanent stain. Women on the stage were assumed to be courtesans, their art inseparable from scandal. For Theodora, this world was both a cage and a classroom. According to Procopius's infamous Secret History, she performed in provocative plays and delighted audiences with bold humour. He relished recounting lurid details, likely exaggerated to discredit her later as Empress. But what emerges from beneath his venom is a woman who had mastered attention. She learned how to work a crowd, how to charm men of rank, and how to survive in a society eager to discard women like her once their beauty faded. Theodora's career as a courtesan also introduced her to the circles of influence that orbited Constantinople's elite. Wealthy patrons, officials, and even foreign envoys mingled in the city's theatres and pleasure houses. For a clever woman, these encounters provided opportunities to build networks far beyond the reach of her birth. Theodora, with her quick wit and eloquence, was no ordinary courtesan. She impressed not merely with beauty, but with intelligence and sharp conversation, traits that would later distinguish her at court. Her life took a dramatic turn when she travelled east to North Africa, living for a time in Alexandria. There she encountered new philosophies and Christian teachings that reshaped her outlook. Some sources suggest she embraced a pious life upon returning to Constantinople, abandoning the theatre and focusing instead on weaving and modest work. Whether her repentance was genuine or strategic, it changed how people perceived her. No longer merely an entertainer, she began to reinvent herself. Theodora's transformation from courtesan to penitent woman was remarkable in a society that rarely forgave women for their past. She had stared down disgrace and found a way to reframe her story. By the time she returned to Constantinople, she was no longer just an actress with a scandalous reputation. She was a woman poised for something greater. Her intelligence, resilience, and ability to navigate both the pleasures and perils of Byzantium had prepared her for an encounter that would change history: meeting Justinian. When Theodora returned to Constantinople after her time in Alexandria, she was no longer the carefree performer of her youth. She carried herself differently, still witty and charismatic, but tempered by experience, and according to some accounts, more pious. It was during this period of reinvention that she crossed paths with a man whose destiny was already unfolding. Justinian, the ambitious nephew of Emperor Justin III. Justinian was captivated by her almost immediately. He was not drawn only to her beauty, though she was striking, but to her eloquence and sharp intellect. In an empire where most women were expected to remain silent in political matters, Theodora was different. She could debate, she could advise, and she could argue with conviction. For a man like Justinian, already envisioning reforms, conquests, and imperial grandeur, Theodora was the ideal partner, not merely a lover. There was one obstacle: Byzantine law. At the time, men of senatorial rank were forbidden to marry actresses, a ban that would have made marriage impossible for Justinian and Theodora. But Justinian's determination was legendary. He persuaded his uncle, the emperor, to change the law in 524 CE, specifically allowing such unions. By 525, Theodora was not only his wife, but also his closest confidant. Their marriage was unusual for the time, not arranged for political gain, not simply a convenient match, but a bond rooted in mutual respect and partnership. Contemporaries were scandalized. Many in the court could not forget Theodora's past, whispering about her early life as if it disqualified her from sharing imperial power. But Justinian ignored the gossip. He saw in her what others could not: a woman of remarkable resilience, unshakable loyalty, and keen judgment. To him, she was indispensable. Their marriage also marked the beginning of a new chapter in Byzantine politics. Unlike most imperial consorts, Theodora did not remain in the background. She sat beside Justinian, advised him in council, and even had laws issued in her name. For the first time, the Byzantine Empire had a true imperial partnership, with a woman from the margins of society elevated to the highest throne in Christendom. What began as a scandalous match became one of the most enduring partnerships of the ancient world. Theodora had defied her past, defied the law, and defied the expectations of her society. With Justinian at her side, she was no longer an actress or courtesan. She was an empress in the making. When Justinian ascended the throne in 527 CE, Theodora was crowned alongside him, not as a silent consort, but as Augusta, Empress of the Byzantine Empire. This act alone was extraordinary. Traditionally, Imperial wives were respected but politically invisible, their influence confined to the private sphere. Theodora broke this pattern instantly. From the moment the crown touched her head, she made it clear she intended to be more than ornamental. Theodora sat beside Justinian in court and appeared with him in public ceremonies. Mosaics from Ravenna immortalize her regal presence, draped in purple robes and jewels, exuding authority. She was no mere companion, she was a co-ruler, acknowledged as such by foreign envoys and Byzantine subjects alike. Justinian, far from keeping her at arm's length, valued her counsel. He sought her opinion on matters of state, relied on her judgment in legal disputes, and even allowed her to sponsor legislation in her own name. Her influence quickly became visible in social reforms. Theodora championed laws protecting women and children, many of them shaped by her own difficult past. Brothel keepers were forbidden from forcing women into prostitution, and laws were enacted to give actresses and courtesans new opportunities to leave their professions. She established houses of refuge for women who wanted to escape exploitation, offering them food, shelter, and training. These policies were unprecedented in Byzantium and reveal her deep empathy for those who, like her younger self, had been trapped at society's margins. Theodora also strengthened protections for married women. New laws increased the penalties for rape and expanded women's rights in divorce and property disputes. In a patriarchal world where women's voices were often silenced, her reforms gave them a measure of security and recognition they had rarely known before. Naturally, her activism drew criticism. Aristocrats sneered at her background, while conservative clergy grumbled about her audacity to shape laws. Chroniclers hostile to her, like Procopius, depicted her as domineering, ruthless, and even cruel. Yet the very venom of her critics confirms her extraordinary power. Few women of the age commanded such authority, and fewer still were resented so fiercely for it. By the end of the 520s, Theodora was no longer the courtesan whispered about in taverns. She was Empress, legislator, and protector of the vulnerable, a woman who had taken her painful past and transformed it into a platform for justice and power. In January of 532 CE, Theodora faced the moment that would define her legacy, not as a courtesan, nor as Justinian's wife, but as a ruler in her own right. Constantinople erupted in chaos during the Nika Revolt, a violent uprising that began with tensions between rival chariot racing factions in the Hippodrome. What started as a sporting rivalry between the Blues and the Greens quickly exploded into a political rebellion against Justinian's heavy taxes and unpopular policies. For 5 days, the city burned. Mobs stormed the streets, torched public buildings, and demanded Justinian's overthrow. The rebellion culminated in a dramatic moment inside the palace. Justinian, rattled by the violence and the scale of destruction, considered fleeing the capital. His advisors whispered of retreat to safety, abandoning Constantinople to the rioters. Many expected Theodora to remain silent or follow her husband into exile. Instead, she rose to speak. Her words, preserved by historians, resound through the centuries. She reminded Justinian and his council that emperors are not made to run. Royalty is a fine burial shroud, she declared, insisting it was better to die as rulers than to live in disgrace as fugitives. In that instant, Theodora's courage stiffened Justinian's resolve. Her defiance turned panic into determination, and the court chose to fight rather than flee. The decision was brutal. Justinian summoned his generals, Belisarius and Mundus, who devised a plan to trap the rioters in the Hippodrome. Imperial troops stormed in, cutting down rebels in a massacre that left tens of thousands dead. The revolt was crushed with overwhelming force, and Justinian's throne was secured, but it was Theodora's resolve that made it possible. The Nika revolt revealed her steel. To the people of Constantinople, she was no longer merely the empress who had risen from scandal. She was the co-sovereign whose courage saved the empire. Theodora had transformed her past hardships into unshakable determination. She understood humiliation, and she refused to let Justinian or herself endure it again. From that day on, no one in Byzantium could doubt her influence. Theodora was not a consort hiding in the shadows of power. She was its backbone, a voice of iron when others faltered. The Empress had proven herself in fire and blood, and the Empire would never forget it. After the smoke of the Nika revolt cleared, Theodora turned her focus not only to securing Justinian's rule, but also to reshaping Byzantine society. She knew the pain of exploitation firsthand, and unlike many rulers of her time, she remembered those left voiceless and powerless. As Empress, she wielded her influence to pass reforms that directly improved the lives of women and the marginalized. One of her most groundbreaking acts was aimed at protecting women forced into prostitution. She passed laws that banned brothel keepers from coercing young girls into the trade and made it easier for women to lead lives of exploitation. To support them, Theodora established institutions like the Convent of the Metanoia, a refuge where former prostitutes could find shelter, food, and training in weaving and other crafts. For many, this was the first chance at dignity and stability they had ever known. Her legal reforms extended to marriage and family life. She pushed through laws granting women greater rights in divorce, allowing them to leave abusive husbands and claim dowries more securely. Rape laws were tightened, with harsher punishments for offenders, while widows were given more protection against predatory relatives. These were not minor tweaks, but major shifts in a society where women were largely expected to endure hardship silently. Theodora also recognized the vulnerabilities of children and the poor. She expanded protections for orphans, ensuring they could inherit property and be shielded from exploitation by guardians. At her urging, laws curbed the trafficking of young girls across the empire. To the wealthy elite, these measures seemed unnecessary or even scandalous. Why should an empress care so deeply for those at the bottom? But for the powerless, her reforms were lifelines. Of course, critics painted her actions as hypocrisy, suggesting she overcompensated for her own scandalous past. Procopius, in his venomous secret history, accused her of cruelty and vanity, insisting her piety was a mask. Yet even his spiteful accounts cannot erase the fact that her reforms outlasted her reign, shaping Byzantine law for generations. Through her policies, Theodora redefined what it meant to be an empress. She was not content with jewels, ceremonies, or mosaics. She used power as a tool of transformation. For women in Constantinople, her reign meant more than symbolic grandeur. It meant real, tangible change in their daily lives. By the mid-6th century, Theodora was no longer viewed as merely Justinian's companion. She was acknowledged, even by her enemies, as a formidable political force. Behind the glittering walls of the great palace, she maneuvered with a mix of sharp intelligence and unyielding will, often clashing with Justinian's most powerful advisors and the church hierarchy itself. Her influence over policy was unmistakable. While Justinian pursued his grand vision of legal codification and imperial expansion, Theodora balanced these ambitions with her own agenda. She often acted as the voice of restraint, urging him to consider the human costs of conquest and taxation. Yet at the same time, she did not shy away from ruthless pragmatism. When her allies were threatened, she intervened decisively, ensuring that loyal supporters remained in key positions, while rivals quietly disappeared from influence. Theodora's political acumen was particularly visible in her dealings with the church. The empire was deeply divided between Orthodox Chalcedonian Christians and the Monophysites, who rejected the official doctrine about the dual nature of Christ. While Justinian leaned toward orthodoxy, Theodora championed the Monophysites, providing them refuge in Constantinople and using her position to shield their leaders from persecution. To her critics, this was dangerous heresy. To her allies, it was proof of her courage to defy the establishment. In doing so, she carved out her own religious constituency, one that strengthened her political base. Her clashes with Justinian's advisors could be equally dramatic. Generals like Belisarius and Narses often found themselves navigating not only the emperor's commands, but also Theodora's sharp interventions. She had little patience for incompetence or disloyalty, and she was not afraid to humiliate high-ranking men if it meant protecting the stability of the empire or her own authority. Even foreign envoys recognized her clout. When ambassadors from Persia, Africa, or Italy arrived, they often sought audiences with both Justinian and Theodora, knowing that imperial policy was shaped in tandem. To ignore her would have been political suicide. Her enemies whispered that she was manipulative, power-hungry, even tyrannical. Yet her ability to survive in the brutal world of Byzantine politics proves she was far more than a figurehead. Theodora had clawed her way from the stage of the Hippodrome to the throne of empire, and she intended to wield power as effectively as any emperor before her. By the 540s, Empress Theodora had reigned for nearly 2 decades alongside Justinian, and though her power was undiminished, her health began to fail. Chroniclers describe her suffering from a long and painful illness, most likely breast cancer, that slowly sapped her strength. Yet, even as her body weakened, her resolve remained ironclad. She continued to attend councils, issue orders, and correspond with allies, ensuring that her voice remained central in the empire's affairs. Her partnership with Justinian deepened in these final years. The emperor, known for his tireless energy and endless reforms, leaned heavily on Theodora for advice and support. Their bond had always been unusual for an imperial couple. Not distant or ceremonial, but close, affectionate, and mutually dependent. In her final years, their love became as much a political asset as a personal comfort. Justinian trusted her judgment absolutely, and her presence steadied him in moments of crisis. Theodora also used her remaining influence to secure the future of the causes she had championed. She reinforced protections for the Monophysite community, ensuring they retained imperial backing even after her death. She worked to preserve the laws she had shaped on women's rights, emphasizing to Justinian and his legal scholars that they must remain part of the empire's lasting legal code. Her vision was not confined to her own lifetime. She was determined to leave behind a legacy that would endure long after she was gone. Despite her failing health, Theodora continued to project strength. She appeared in public ceremonies dressed in full regalia, her jeweled crown and purple robes masking the toll of her illness. To the people of Constantinople, she was still the empress who had faced down the Nika revolt, who had rewritten the laws of the land, and who had stood unflinching at Justinian's side. In 548 CE, Theodora finally succumbed to her illness at around 48 years of age. Her death devastated Justinian, who never remarried. The emperor who had reshaped the Byzantine Empire had lost not just his wife, but his most trusted partner. Theodora was laid to rest in the imperial mausoleum of the Church of the Holy Apostles, her memory enshrined in mosaics and chronicles that captured her extraordinary journey. She had risen from the margins of society to the very pinnacle of power, and even in her final struggles, she remained a symbol of resilience, ambition, and unshakable will. Theodora's death in 548 CE did not end her influence. In many ways, her legacy only grew stronger, carried forward by the laws she inspired, the mosaics that immortalized her image, and the legends that swirled around her name. History remembers her not merely as Justinian's wife, but as a ruler in her own right, one of the most remarkable women of the ancient world. The reforms she championed outlived her. Byzantine law retained many of her protections for women, especially regarding property, divorce, and protection from exploitation. These statutes echoed for centuries, influencing how women were treated within the empire. The convents and refuges she established continued to offer sanctuary to vulnerable women long after her passing, testaments to her determination to give dignity to those who shared her difficult beginnings. Her political role also redefined the expectations of imperial women. Before Theodora, most empresses were seen as ceremonial figures, symbols of dynastic continuity rather than agents of power. After her, no one could deny that an empress might wield true authority. She set a precedent for partnership at the highest level, proving that political wisdom and resolve were not confined to men. Yet, her legacy has always been contested. Chroniclers like Procopius wrote 2 conflicting versions of her. In his Wars, she appears as a capable co-ruler. In his Secret History, she is vilified as ruthless, scandalous, and manipulative. These contradictions reveal less about Theodora herself, and more about the unease she provoked. a woman who rose from courtesan to empress, who stood in council chambers, and who bent laws to her will, unsettled the patriarchal order of Byzantium. To some, she was a saintly protector. To others, a dangerous usurper of male authority. Today, mosaics in Ravenna still portray her in shimmering tesserae, draped in purple, her gaze calm and commanding. They remind us of the woman who defied every expectation, rewriting her fate with iron determination. Theodora's life story remains one of the most extraordinary arcs in history. From a girl begging for survival in the hippodrome, to an actress condemned as immoral, to the empress who co-ruled the Byzantine Empire at its height. Her legacy lies not only in laws and legends, but in the enduring truth she embodied, that power can be seized, transformed, and wielded, even by those the world tries hardest to silence.